Many thanks to whoever is recording. Um, First, a little bit about me. My name is Zach. I have done debate for too long. My debate accomplishments include misinterpreting three motions in one tournament, losing in Yale quarters on a 2-1 decision on the topic, "This House believes that socialism is the best form of government," by arguing that communism is better. Uh, yeah, those are just two of my biggest debate accomplishments. Uh, those of you who are in the room who know me know that I have many more embarrassing stories in debate. I'm super excited though to be chatting with all of you today about the magic wand PMR LOR. In other words, I believe very strongly that no matter what is happening up to that point, any round is winnable in the PMR or the LOR. You can be absolutely getting crushed on the flow. You can think that you have no chance be going up against the best team in the tournament. And if you give the perfect PMR, you can win the round. That's not to say that I always do. I lose all of the time giving PMRs that looking back, I could have done things way different. But it is my favorite speech. It will always be my favorite speech. And I also think it will be the most fun speech to give. And you have the most kind of creative license to use what has been said in the round before to put a puzzle together. And I already said this to my lab, but the way I view debate is that the first four speeches in the round, the constructive speeches, are essentially four speeches which establish all of the puzzle pieces that both teams can use. And then the PMR and the LOR want to put those puzzle pieces together to create a narrative, to create a story that is compelling to a judge that'll ask them to vote for you. So the PMR and the LOR are all about round vision. It's seeing what all of the pieces of the puzzle are and seeing how you can best put them together to win the round. What are we going to be chatting about today? So we're going to start just by talking very broadly about what a good structure of a PMR or LOR looks like, because I think, it's hard to give a golden or a whatever, a magic wand, whatever random term I came up with, which I'll pretend is like a generally accepted term, uh, if you don't actually know how to structure one in the first place. And then we're going to talk about four strategies that you can use in the PMR and the LOR in order to win rounds that you're severely losing. So we'll chat about PMR golden turns, we'll chat about cross-applying arguments, narrow collapses, and finally, and my personal favorite, much to the chagrin of many other people, and yes, I won many rounds. I probably shouldn't have doing this, but the rhetorical PMR or LOR, where you don't win on the flow, you tank the flow, but you're still able to win the round for reasons that we'll chat about in just a bit. A final note on questions. I will have time for questions at the end, and I know that like as a camper, you might be like, "Oh, I don't want to interrupt this guy," but like I promise I'm not that scary. You can interrupt me. I am more than happy to answer questions throughout in the chat, out loud, whatever you want, by delivering me a message via pigeon. I don't know, whatever you feel like doing. I'm more than happy
What
to.
is PMR?
Oh, yes. Fantastic question. So, the PMR is the last speech of the round. So, the basically the six speeches in any parliamentary debate round is you have the Prime Minister constructive, which is the first government speech where you put forth your arguments. You have the Leader of Opposition constructive, which is 8 minutes where you respond to the Prime Minister and you create your own arguments. Then you have the Member of Government, where you basically, refute your opponent's points and defend your own. The member of opposition, where you refute your opponent's points and defend your own. And then you have the two rebuttal speeches, the prime minister rebuttal and the leader of opposition rebuttal. And in these are only 4 and 5 minutes. You're not allowed to make any new arguments with some caveats we'll talk about later. But you want to holistically tie the debate together, and we'll chat about how to do that effectively in just a second. Any other questions before we move on? I will take that silence as a no. So let's talk about structuring the PMR and the LOR. So, what is the role of the PMR and LOR? And one of my favorite debaters and good friends used to always say, like, you can flow the PMR or LOR on your ballot because it'll be your RFD. And like ideally that is what it can be. It can be basically your judge's reason for decision. So what that means is that you want to identify the most important piece of offense. Which puzzle piece is really that winning piece? And especially when there's so much content in the round, this can be a lot harder than you would think. Second, you need to make sure that you're actually winning that piece of offense. A lot of times, what people will do is they will, be like, "This is the most important impact in the round," and then like they won't actually gain access to their impact. So equally important as a lot of the broad narrative things as to why something ought be valued over other things within the context of the debate is merely the fact of does X argument cause Y, which you need to establish and reiterate in the PMR or the LOR. The final thing that you need to do is weigh that piece of offense against all other offense in the round. So basically, that's a lot of debate jargon. What this actually means is just explain that your argument is more important than every other argument that has been said in the round. And if you can prove that you win the most important argument, then you have won the debate. And I think that this is very counterintuitive to a lot of newer debaters, because a lot of newer debaters think that these last speeches are about responding to every argument possible. It's about winning every argument, but not every argument is created equally. And despite how like amazing it would be for you to win every argument, by the end of the debate, there's like so many things that have been said, and what your job is to pick out and highlight what you want the judge to focus on their ballot. What does this actually look like in practice? And this looks a little bit different for different people. Like, I will admit I have given PMRs and LORs that don't fit this structure. But broadly, what does it look like, just so everyone knows? The PMR, you'll notice, is a minute longer than the LOR. You might be saying, why is it a minute longer? The reason why it's a minute longer is because you have to respond to pretty much 13 minutes straight of opposition material. Because as I think Sophie just put in the chat, you can see that the member of opposition speaks right next to the leader of opposition rebuttal. They're basically one block. It's called the op block. So the PMR has a lot of stuff to respond to. That is to say that, like, there is material that was new in the MO that the LOR likely said was very important that you need to either clarify, give extraneous responses to, or put specific defense or have specific responses to the ballots that the LOR and the MO go for. Usually the LOR, specifically at the high school level, because most of the time MOs aren't really kind of collapsing on a few ballots. More on what a ballot is in just a second. And the remaining 4 minutes should just be on 1 to 3 ballots. The LOR, you just had the MO do all of the responses. And this is my biggest pet peeve with LORs in general, is they'll spend like 2 minutes just like repeating arguments that were just said in MO. And like Gov hasn't even had a chance to respond to MO yet. So like instead of like showing that you don't trust your partner or like trying to like re-explain things your partner already explained, focus on things that are unique and different. Focus on your ballots, not talking about random responses that your partner just mentioned. What then is a ballot? Basically, it is a reasonable RFD that the judge could have. So when you're giving 1 to 3 ballots, you're saying, this can be your RFD. But even if I didn't say that, this can be your RFD. For those of you who don't know, RFD is a reason for decision or a reason for why a judge is choosing your team over your opponents. The one thing I will just briefly flag here is that ballots exist independent of one another. If your second ballot relies on your first ballot, then it isn't really a unique ballot. The idea is that if you do want to present more than one ballot, so let's say you're saying 2 or 3 ballots, the second and third ballots should be winning the round without the first one, because you could give an RFD just on one of these ballots and explain why that is winning. Every ballot, as I mentioned kind of before, should have 3 components. One, you should extend the argument that you're talking about. In other words, reiterate that argument. Two, you should defend the argument. Oftentimes, people will forget to defend it. And this, you should flag all responses that your opponents have made that could reasonably be cross-applied or be perceived as the judge as responsive to this ballot. So even if your opponents didn't like signpost something perfectly, they didn't flag it as a direct response to this argument, you still want to make sure that you're dealing with that defense before you collapse on any ballot. Third and finally, you want to weigh the argument. What this means for those of you who don't know weighing is essentially say at the end of 90 to 95% of rounds, both teams will have some degree of offense. And what I mean by offense is some reason why their side is better. Otherwise, it like probably wouldn't be a debate topic in the first place. Like debate topics are written by generally smart people who have thought about the arguments that can be made for both sides and broadly understand that like by the end of most debates, there will be some degree of offense that is left in the round. I see like me neither in the chat. Is that a question? Okay. Seeing no hand or unmuting, I will assume it is not a question. But does anyone else have questions about the basic structure of a PMR or LOR before I talk about the techniques I use when I'm severely losing a round going into one of these speeches?
I have a quick question.
Yep, shoot away.
How much time do you think we should spend in like each of the three parts of a ballot?
Fantastic question. And the short answer is it's very, very hard for me to give a uniform answer. The reason why is that like if they have one response, you don't want to spend like a minute like frontlining or defending the one response they gave, right? But if it's like a really dense round, then you need to spend more time kind of, defending your argument. The one thing I will say is that 99% of the time people spend way, 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 way too much time extending and not enough time weighing, is the broad advice I have for people, which is that like I have seen people like extend and defend the argument and then be like, and this outweighs on severity. Our second ballot is X. Like that is not weighing. And like your lab leaders will help you kind of, throughout the course of camp to talk about what good weighing looks like, but making sure that you leave enough time to robustly weigh in the rebuttal speeches is particularly important. Um, yes. Balthazar, sorry if I'm sure I
Yeah,
mispronounced that badly.
no worries. I have a quick question. So, should the MO also spend some time covering ballots if there are a lot?
This is a very good question. Um, when I MO, I personally like to sometimes have independent MO ballots. Um, but I don't think it is necessary for sure. The one thing I will say is that if a ballot is in the MO, it doesn't need to be stated again in the LOR for another minute and a half. They should be independent of each other, such that you're not like the MO isn't like there is a ballot on X, and then the LOR's entire speech is a ballot on X. So, if you are going to do a ballot in the MO, this needs to be communicated before the MO. Broadly speaking, I think you and your partner should decide on what the ballots are going to be before the MO so that the speeches can kind of work together to build towards those ballots. And obviously, that comes with time, it comes with trusting your partner, etc. So, obviously, this is easier said than done, but if you can, definitely try to develop those ballots earlier. Two questions. Wait, yo, go ahead. Sorry, was there a question? Someone was going to unmute. I was going to answer the questions in the chat, but
Somebody said two questions, and then I was about to ask a question, so I said something, and then I shut up because I thought that I should let them speak, and then I don't know. Okay. Anyways, so I'm just gonna ask my question. If I saw before when they were like introducing us to like the camp, they said that you should probably check up with your partner to see like if they're like going to attend. Um, like what happens if your partner doesn't like end up showing up? because I don't know how to contact my partner.
Is this for a practice round or for the camp tournament?
I guess either one's fine. Like what do you do in both situations then?
What you should probably do is just text Ethan that you haven't been hearing back from your partner, just so he knows that that's a possibility. And then he will make sure that you're able to participate if you're available, because yeah, we want everyone who's available to be able to participate. And
Got it. How do I text them in the first place?
Ethan's number should be in the email that he sent out to everyone. So you should be able to just check your email and his number will be there. Um,
Not Ethan, but my partner. How do I text my
You, I
partner?
mean, please, I would save logistics questions for me or Ethan. Zach is giving a lecture right now.
yeah,
Sorry.
no worries. Feel free to just direct message, Kyler or Ethan, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to help you out. On the two questions that are in the chat, should you extend significantly framing and definitions even if they were already established? Okay, you don't want to get me started on my rant on frameworks. My rant on frameworks is that they're just weighing arguments that are said in the first speech. So if someone is saying like our framework is deontology, they're basically saying you ought prioritize this principled argument over their pragmatic arguments. So it's a form of weighing that you just say in the first speech, usually without warranting it out, as a reason to have like under-explained weighing arguments. So I think that like broadly speaking, framing is weighing and therefore should be kind of talked about in the weighing kind of category. Also, advice for you all, if someone says the framework is deontology and doesn't justify it, you are allowed to respond to that framework so that they can't come up in the PMR and be like, they don't respond to deontology, so that is what was agreed upon, so we win because they have no arguments that talk about anything related to deontology. So, yeah, that's the thing about framing. Broadly speaking, though, I think extending things that were not really chatted about is a broad waste of time, or at least doing it for extended periods of time. So, if there is something that is fully established in the round, don't talk about it that much. The one exception to this is if there is a new implication of what you are saying. That's to say that, like, let's say there's an observation you made in PMC at the top of your case, and you realize how it takes out all of their arguments or something. You can say, this was the observation that goes conceded. That is the thing that like is established. Here's why this is strategically important to us. And it is sometimes useful to spend a good deal of time talking about why it's strategically helpful and implicating that observation in a strategic way. The second question in round, if you have an idea or a good point, how do you communicate with your partner? I feel that giving any generalizable feedback or any generalizable suggestion here would probably be a little bit unhelpful, just given the fact that every partnership communicates differently, as they should. In tournaments where computers are allowed, people will sometimes write things on the flow. Sometimes people will text in kind of tournaments where that's allowed. Otherwise, if it's in person, you can go over and whisper to your partner. You can write it on a piece of paper and hand it to your partner. So I think that that is the something that you need to have a conversation with your partner about what works most effectively for you. Yes. Final question before we move on.
So for framework arguments or like many side framework debates that are going on, what would you like recommend? Like if there's no real consensus and both sides are arguing to keep their framework, in terms of weighing, what would you do in the third speech?
Yeah, I think that, like, as I said, especially because framing is usually just a way to frame an argument slash weigh the argument, I think that there are two strategies. If you think that you're losing everywhere else on the flow, and we'll talk about this, it's a great idea for a narrow collapse. Go all in, so give like 3 minutes of weighing arguments as to why your framing is better than their framing, and then explain why you win under your framework. If you think that you're winning elsewhere on the flow, slash you think that you are the better team, then you usually want to create as many contingencies as possible. So you might want to spend a little bit, one of your ballots can be under your framework and explaining why that is the most important ballot. But even if you don't think that's the most important ballot, then under their framework, this ballot still outweighs. So it really depends heavily on the round. But my general rule of thumb, which I'm going to chat about in just a second, is the more you feel like you're winning, the more ballots and more contingencies you probably have the luxury of making. If you feel like you're losing, you really need to do something narrow, robustly prove it, and kind of go all in, hoping that the judge buys that kind of argumentation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. First strategy then on how to save rounds where you're losing. I love this strategy, and op teams will probably hate you when you use it, but it's fine. It's a good strategy. What is a PMR golden turn? It's also called many other things. If like it is a new flip in the PMR, flipping the MO, PMR golden turn, they're all the same. What is it though? It's basically when you turn or flip a new argument that was made in the MO. Because remember, in the rules of Parley, you're not allowed to make new arguments in the PMR, with the exception of responding to new arguments that were made in the MO. That means that because it's Gov's first chance to respond to any content in the MO, you are able to generate new content here. Okay, what are the three components that you need in a golden turn? One, you actually just need to flip the argument. So you need to think of what the flip is and, explain that. Two, you need to weigh why the offense generated off of the flip outweighs the offense generated by the MO argument, right? Because oftentimes the flip generates new offense for you, but doesn't necessarily simultaneously take out what the MO said in terms of their offense. Therefore, you need to explain why the flip is more meaningful than the argument it is flipping. Third and finally, you need to weigh this new piece of PMR offense or this new PMR argument over the rest of the debate. So basically here you want to explain why even if, you lost everything that was said prior, that nothing that was previously said in the debate flows to your side, that you should still vote Gov because of this new piece of offense. And yeah, I already explained why PMR golden turns are allowed, but make sure that you are very explicit when you are making them. Be like, they made a new argument in the MO. That was where they lost the round because we're allowed to make a new response in the PMR. The new response is the only ballot. We're going to tell you X, and then blah, 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 blah. You can win the debate after doing that.
Oh, I got a question.
Yes, question about
What do you mean by like flip? Like,
flip is just another word for turn. It's the exact same thing. Do you want me to? I'll explain what a turn is, probably, because even if you know, someone else probably is slightly confused. A turn is a type of rebuttal that generates offense for your side. So if they have an argument, for example, that impacts let's say it impacts to mental health. Instead of saying opposition does not harm mental health, a flip would be an argument that says, no, opposition is actively worse for mental health for this reason. So it's not only something that takes out the argument, it's one that flips it to your side or turns it to your side, depending on what words you're using. Cool. Why is the PMR strategic? Cool, yeah, I'll take the question before I talk about strategy.
I was just wondering how you layer it above everything else in the debate.
It depends on what it is, right? Oftentimes, and I personally love doing this, op used the same weighing. So let's say like the MO's new argument is about mental health, right? And they explain why mental health is important. Sometimes you can just go up and be like, MO says that mental health is the most important argument in the debate. I'm going to flip the argument, explain why we win mental health, and co-opt their weighing. That's one way to do it. Or let's say it's a new piece of content that isn't weighed. You just weigh it like any other piece of offense as if that piece of offense was said in the PMC. So you'd say like, if the argument about mental health was in the PMC, how would you think about weighing it? Does it affect more people? Does it, affect people more severely? Is it a prerequisite to other things on the flow, et cetera, et cetera? Why is it strategic? One, you can just like be losing everything. Like there can be like nothing on the flow to the point where like if PMC and MG stand up and say nothing, spend like 5 seconds on their speech, you can still win with this strategy. So it basically doesn't rely on a single thing that was said earlier in the round. Second, judges do tend to be quite liberal with what constitutes a turn or a flip. So therefore, things like Lincoln's, kind of fall under the broader category of, flipping arguments. Gives you a lot of different avenues to think about how to give a PMR golden turn. And finally, it's great because op can't respond. You know, one of my favorite debaters would always go like, what might opposition say to this argument? They might say X. Sadly, they have no speeches left, so they can't. But I'll respond to judge intervention anyway. It's like, whatever. It's a little like quip where you can like, they don't really get a chance to respond. And you can also basically, you should still be preempting ways that like the judge can intervene, given that like the PMR is usually heavily sniff tested, especially new arguments that are made in the PMR. But you also like it is just advantageous to not allow them to directly respond. And yes, this is only applicable to arguments that are new MO arguments. Briefly on pitfalls, because this sounds just like perfect, you should do it every round. One, as I said, judges will heavily sniff test the PMR. If the argument makes no sense, just because op didn't respond to it, it doesn't mean it is winning. You do need to like preempt possible holes in the argument and robustly warrant the argument as you would any PMC argument or any good turn that you read any elsewhere in the debate. Two, like turning it is not enough. You need to compare this turn to every other argument made in the round. Like it is on the same playing field as other arguments. So, just because it is unresponded to does not mean that you don't need to weigh it against the rest of the debate. Finally, judges are incredibly generous with cross applications of PMR golden turns. So that means if MO said something or even LO said something that is tangentially related or could be cross applied as defense to this PMR golden turn, they likely will, given the fact that they never had the chance to directly respond. And therefore, you should flag, be like, judge, you might cross apply this random thing they said in LO. Here's why it doesn't apply, or something to that extent. Questions about PMR golden turns before we talk about, ironically, cross applications? Yes, question.
So it's basically a golden PMR turn thing. It's just basically you turn their argument against theirs, right?
Yes, so but it only applies to new MO arguments. So you're basically turning a new piece of content that was made in the MO and making it an argument for yourself while creating new PMR offense. So it only applies in very specific situations, but when it does apply, it can be very powerful.
Thanks.
Of course. Do you need to announce what you're doing before you speak? I mean, it's the same thing with anything else. I personally don't love off-time roadmaps, so whenever I PMR golden turn, I'll start my speech. I'll just like start my time and be like, op was winning the round until they made a new argument in the MO. This speech is going to flip that argument and explain why the flip of that argument outweighs everything else that was said in the debate. What was that argument? And then I would start. So like that's how I personally do it. Some people do an off-time roadmap. They'll just be like, it'll be 2 PMR golden turns or whatever. Or if it's a super like technical judge, or we'll, give an off-time roadmap explaining it. However you would usually structure your speech, you can usually just probably cross-apply to a PMR golden turn speech as well. Could you refute the argument and explain why your argument outweighs? I'm a little bit confused about the question in the chat, just because in order for your refutation to generate offense, it needs to be a flip. Because if it's just like saying that the argument is non-unique, for example, then it's not an active reason to vote for you. So a PMR golden turn can't just be like, you can never win a round by disproving one of their arguments. You can only win rounds by having offense left, by proving that there is an active reason to vote for your side. So it does have to be a flip or a refutation that generates offense. Yes, Geneva.
Hi, thank you. So, could a judge cross apply an argument that the other side made to your golden turn, even if they're losing that argument on other parts of the flow based on other arguments that you were making but are now dropping? Sorry if doesn't make sense.
Yes. Well, that's what I was trying to say with like judges. I mean, it oftentimes comes down to paradigmatic preference quite heavily, but I do think that judges do tend to be quite liberal with what does constitute a PMR, like what constitutes a cross application that could be made. In some instances, your PMR turn is just so niche that there is really no cross applications, which is like golden. No pun intended, but it's like a PMR golden turn. See what I did there? But also, I think more broadly, in instances where there is something, if you flag it and point out to the judge, be like, I don't think you can cross apply this, but let's say you think it. Here's how we're going to preempt it. I think that can be very rhetorically persuasive. For the interest of time, I'm just going to hold on questions until we get through the next section on cross applying arguments. So, how do you save drops in the PMR and the LOR? It was like, classic rebuttal speaker thing is to blame the member. They dropped it. I couldn't do anything in the PMR. I was just losing all along. Like, no. I don't care if they drop every single argument. Don't make that excuse. So if your partner drops something in the member, they probably didn't actually drop it. What do I mean by that? Because everything previously said in the debate are puzzle pieces. So let's say they go like, in response to their first argument, we have 3 responses, and they forget to respond to the second argument. One of those 3 responses probably can be cross-applied to the second argument. And the reason why I say that is most cases rely on certain underlying premises that exist between different arguments. Therefore, in the PMR and LOR, you can extend a response from the first argument to the second argument and explain why it acts as a refutation.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
How would you word that in a like not funny way? Because like I could tell the judge, "Hey, judge, my partner said this. Could you just cross apply that?" But like every time I try to talk about a cross application, it always comes out in a way that doesn't make sense.
Yes, I have never said cross apply in a speech, or I probably have, but I try not to because I agree it sounds not amazing. I think the best way to do it is be like, they say we concede the argument, but my brilliant partner actually responds to the premise. They say this. That engages with the premise. That's a lot better. You don't even need to say it's a cross application. Say it responds to X premise of the argument.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course. The final thing is that even if nothing is said in your partner speech, and there's nothing you can cross-apply from the member speech, there's usually an implicit preemption from the PMC or the LOC. So even if, obviously, it wasn't implicated as a response to the argument because they haven't spoken yet, usually you can take a premise from the PMC or LOC and implicate it as a response later in the round once you've realized that you might have dropped or under-responded to an argument. Questions about that before I go to narrow collapses? Yeah, Sophie.
How do you engage with this while avoiding the new call or avoiding judges from just crossing something off their flow because they feel in their hearts it's too new?
Yeah. I think most judges are paradigmatically not against new cross applications, in my experience at the high school level. But B, as I said, you don't want it to be like, we dropped argument number 2. I am now going to cross-apply response number 2 from argument 1 onto argument 2 because we dropped the argument. Let me remind you guys that we dropped the argument, and here's why I'm saving it. I would never say that. You always want to make your partner sound great. So I would say something to the extent of like, Sophie clearly responds to this premise in MG when she tells you that X. If they new call, you just say, I can read off the flow word for word, and here it is. And then usually it works perfectly. So yeah, it's all about framing and how you frame these arguments and frame them as responses to premises, not drops, stuff like that. If you make it really obvious, some judges will strike it off their flow. Many won't anyway, but still always err on the side of, being careful about this. Finally on narrow collapses, I'm going to just go through this and then take questions at the end just for people who want the full lunch break. I'm more than happy to stay for as long as I need, but I just want to get through all the content. So there are two strategies I want to talk about. First strategy is just having fewer ballots. So my general rule of thumb is that the more you think you're winning the round, the more ballots you should go for. So if you're clearly winning, you can go for 3. That means you only need to spend a minute on each ballot because there's less ink on these ballots. So let's say you only have to frontline 1 response. Well, that would make the ballot take a lot less time. If it's a close round where it's like reasonably dense, you might want to go for 2 ballots. And if you're clearly behind and they have like 5 responses to like everything out of MO, whatever, you usually want to do 1 ballot. If you frontline 2 out of the 5 things on 2 or 3 ballots, that's not going to win you the round. But if you frontline all 5 things on 1 ballot and explain robustly why it is the most important argument in the round, then that can easily be a winning strategy. So that gives you more time to A, comprehensively win the ballot, and B, comprehensively weigh the ballot. The second strategy, though, is to make your ballots themselves narrower. So even let's say you're still going for 2 ballots. Instead of trying to win your entire argument, prove 1 subpoint of your argument and explain why even if you don't buy the rest of the subpoints of that argument, that even winning that 1 individual subpoint is sufficient for you to win the round. So you don't need to prove every single reason it's bad for the environment. If you can prove that, I don't know, it's like bad for like water pollution, if that was one of your impacts, that you can independently weigh as a subpoint rather than being part of the larger argument. This means that A, there are usually just less things for you to defend, and B, it means that you are more able to tailor your weighing to the specific part of the argument that you're going for, rather than broadly saying something like, I don't know, environment is good because of like, it affects everyone. You can have a lot more specific weighing. Cool. Finally, on the rhetorical PMR and LOR, and thank you for helping me out in the chat here about frontlining. Yeah, I personally hate debate jargon and like, yeah, and I'm using it, so I'm very contradictory. But yeah, it's basically just defending an argument. Cool. So what is a rhetorical PMR and LOR? A rhetorical PMR doesn't try to completely win an argument on the flow, but appeal emotionally that your side of the house will be viewed positively in the future. So this often looks like, you explaining that the status quo is so terrible, and that even if success isn't guaranteed, your judge simply cannot vote for inaction because inaction is endorsing inequality or oppression or something like that. In fact, you can oftentimes explicitly characterize the flow as unimportant. For example, you can say like, MO gives you 7 responses, but they're all mechanistic quibbles that don't engage with the heart of our argument. Here's and something that they don't engage with. So instead of line by lining all like 5 responses they do, or frontlining or defending or whatever, however kind of your debate community kind of, talks about that action in a debate round. You don't need to frontline everything. You can group things together and rhetorically try to explain them away. Brief warnings about the rhetorical PMR and LOR. Don't drop MO arguments on your ballot in front of a tech judge. They probably will not vote for you. For those of you who don't know, a tech judge is like a very technical judge, usually are a debater themselves or, have debated in the past. Highly successful debaters usually are highly technical in the way that they judge, and less emotional. And this works far better with parent judges or less experienced judges who oftentimes will view these strategies very positively, who will vote for the PMR because they were the last one to talk and really kind of pushed them to their side. And especially if the PMR or LOR is using ballot directive language. And what I mean by that is like a ballot for them means X. You will vote for them only if you believe X. That sort of language can be like, wait, I don't believe X. Maybe I shouldn't vote for op. because apparently I'm endorsing X, if I'm voting for them. So really using that sort of ballot directive language can be very helpful. Then the last kind of note I will say is usually don't combine this with a line by line. If you're being like doing this is endorsing X, they had 7 responses. I'm going to frontline each of them. Our first frontline, it doesn't work together. And that this is really something that, you really have to go for. It's usually when you're losing the round, and it's usually in front of, judges who you think would be more receptive to this kind of line of argumentation. I've used this for to win many, many rounds that I probably shouldn't have. But I've also used it in rounds where then the judge is like, I really liked the rhetoric, but like you didn't respond to this, and I misread the judge. So like I started to get better at figuring out when to use it later in my debate career, but definitely use the rhetorical PMR and LOR quite sparingly. Amazing. I will now take questions about anything in the presentation. I know I'm already a few minutes over. Shocker, I know. I think at least. I'm pretty sure the schedule says this was supposed to end at 2. Regardless, you're more than welcome to dip. You're more than welcome to stay and ask any questions. I love the PMR and LOR. They're quite fun, especially the PMR. The PMR is very fun, and I can talk about it all day. I have until 2:10. Fantastic. I'm also happy to stay after 2:10 if people have questions. Oh, I love this question. How do you respond to a rhetorical LOR when you are about to give the PMR? My personal opinion, and this is very controversial, and I know many people on this call who don't do this. I don't really start writing my PMR, writing as in like thinking about what I'm going to do in my PMR, until like at least 2.5 minutes into the LOR. I think that PMRs need to not be only responsive to MOs, they need to be responsive to LORs. And responsive doesn't mean like the LOR first said this, I'm going to respond. I mean responsive as in like take them into account when you're deciding what to do for the LOR. I think that I loved PMRing after rhetorical LORs because, I would oftentimes A, use some rhetorical quips myself, and B, break down the rhetoric, and compare it to things. So be like, they say you are voting Gov if you believe X, but I'd say you're voting up if you believe Y. That's the back and forth they tried to go for, to hide all of my partner's brilliant responses from the MG. Here's how we take out that beautiful rhetoric earlier in the round, something like that. Which I think notices if you try to just go super line by line after that and ignore the fact that they had this really powerful narrative, it can definitely fall flat. You want to acknowledge that they had a very compelling narrative, acknowledge the fact that the LOR was rhetorical in some way, persuasive in some way, and then, try to up-layer that either by A, using some rhetoric yourself, or B, using material or puzzle pieces from earlier in the round to kind of dismantle a lot of that rhetoric. Other questions? And it can be about any. I know I sped through the last few just for the sake of time, but I'm more than happy to chat about golden turns, narrow collapses, cross applications, rhetorical PMR or LORs, or even the structure. Yes, Bilal.
Do you have any like tips or tricks on how to identify the most important piece of offense in the round?
Yes. So like the obvious advice, which was the first piece of advice that I got was like, what argument that you have has the most weighable impact, that is the least responded to. And if there's only if they're those are the two axes you consider, and bigger impact / easier to weigh this impact is better, and fewer responses on the argument is better. So I think that is still something I do think about a lot in terms of deciding it. But also, and this is why I like waiting until after the LOR, which argument that you have best engages with on a weighing level the arguments they go for in the LOR. So you can have a massive impact. Like the impact can be I don't know, extinction. And that isn't necessarily what best engages with the impact that is read in the LOR. So I think waiting until the LOR, yes, you should consider the amount of like responses on the argument, um, but also thinking about what do they go for? And if I win this argument, how can that maybe uplayer what they are going for in the LOR? Upstream, uplayer, prove that it is more important, in some capacity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm going to briefly take the question in the chat before I get to you, Benjamin. For the LOR, would you consider a narrow-ish collapse to be disadvantageous considering the PMR can easily read counters to it? It depends on the round. The PMR cannot read new counters to it, though, assuming it was in LO. So I think that especially if you had a very dense MO that had a lot of flips, a lot of new offense, kind of scattered throughout the MO, if you make the LO or the LOR one kind of ballot that's from LOC that might have been dropped or undercovered in MG, they can't really make new responses, or you can POO any new responses made in the PMR. This is why, though, I do think that like a strategy that I often use is doing like yin and yang with like super dense MO with like lots of like flips that are briefly weighed like very generally, and then a very narrow collapse in the LOR, such that the PMR still is like overwhelmed in the sense that they still have a lot of MO material to get through before getting to their ballots, but also helps provide a more kind of cohesive and more robust opportunity to weigh. So I'd say it depends on the round. I would say on average, I go for slightly more ballots in LORs, and the fact that like I also just don't need to respond. So I said 1 to 2 minutes for like clarifications and responses. Sometimes it takes me more than that, to be completely honest. So I think that like LORs I usually go for two, and sometimes don't go for one. But yeah, I have gone for one ballot in an LOR before, and I think it works. Was there a question raised hand from someone, Benjamin?
Yeah, that was me. So I'm second speaker, but I know like this isn't entirely topical, but also when you're creating your arguments, what information would you generally want to know? Like, for example, people will tell me a lot that like you should read the news every day, but like beyond that, what information should I try to digest so that I make like better arguments when I'm like generating the arguments at the start? And also, I guess second speaker, but I don't think you are second speaker, so I don't know if you know too much about that.
I have second spoken a lot. I quite often PM into MO, because I do balloting in the MO, and I think that the PM and the MO are actually quite similar speeches. So I definitely do. In terms of how to develop, you're saying how to develop arguments and responses quickly, it seems, is the crux of your question.
Like, yeah, and also just what information should I look at? Like what information should I read outside of like this actual round? Like just outside information, basically.
100%. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like the like common answers, which are like The Economist is amazing and you should read it, and like, also keep in touch with like current events, things like the New York Times. But also like almost all of the best debaters I know listen to like podcasts, because podcasts will give them ideas for unique arguments that you might not get from just like looking at the news. So I think that by kind of, you know, reading or looking at podcasts, for example, you can make certain themes of arguments moving forward. So talking about, for example, the ways in which like, the human brain doesn't make decisions that are best for themselves, and a lot of reasons for that. Hot emotional states, negativity bias, all of these sorts of things. These are themes of arguments that you can make, based on, certain, podcasts or books that you're reading about that. So certainly highly dependent on what you like to consume and how you like to consume it. But I would definitely say something for current events, something for kind of more unique arguments as well. And I think that these things are quite helpful. Also, talking to other people who are very different than you and have different interests. My dad is quite knowledgeable about economics, and I knew very little about economics. So he would start talking to me. He's like, you should probably like know what an interest rate is. And I'm like, oh, that might be helpful in some debate rounds. and then I learned what it was, and it was quite helpful. So things like this, I think, as well can be very helpful. Um, cool. I think I saw another hand, which I don't see anymore. Oh, sorry, Bethany.
Yeah, sorry, I had a question. So I usually do first speaker and like PM, and then I realized that there's like I'm not sure if you touched on this already, like there's a tendency like when MO like dumps when someone is like an MO dump, right? I don't manage my time really well because there's just like so much to get through. And then like I think I start like doing like too many ballots to the point like I can't really effectively weigh. So I was wondering if you had any tips for like time management or stuff like that. Like, because if I don't properly like weigh one ballot, then I can't move on to my next ballot. But then I see the time ticking down. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. Sorry, I'm briefly going to move given the fact that my computer is at 2%, but I will be answering this as I move. I think that the bigger the dump, the narrower the collapse, which I mentioned, which I think is counterintuitive, but I think the more you get practice with it, you'll start to realize because like I personally MO dump as well. So I do have some love for the MO dumpers among us. But I do think that like most of what I dump when I am MO can just not be important for most ballots. So what I mean by this is that like ask yourself, if I don't respond to this, will this change the result of the round? If the answer is no, don't spend time on it. I think that broadly as well, most MO dumps are dumping defense. You don't need to respond to defense. Even if you think the argument is like absurd, just to drop it. Like, you should be dropping all defense on arguments that you are not going for. You should only be responding to refutations against ballots that you are actually going to be weighing and explaining later in the round. So, that's the biggest piece of advice. Um, the other thing I will say, because sometimes MOs will just read a bunch of new offense, right? So if they're reading new offense and not new defense, let's say they read a bunch of new flips or even a bunch of new arguments, the best way usually to handle this is one of two things. One, you can group these flips together because they usually all rely on one or two premises that you can then respond to. B, you can group them together and outweigh all of them or and C really, you should usually point out to the judge that if they're reading 10 flips, they're probably not weighing and implicating all 10 of them. So like usually they're not really votable issues insofar as that they're not implicated slash weighed adequately in the MO. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? I also don't know why I'm still sharing my screen. I'm happy to do this so I can see the chat more easily. I'm also happy to stay behind if people would like if we want to stop the recording and just answer more questions in a smaller environment if you want to stick behind if you still have questions.